Okay, shall we start?
1 second. Sorry, it's still loading, it says.
Oh, okay.
It does say it's live streaming, but 1 minute. Let me make sure that I can see it. Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome our participants and everyone watching this event to the third day of our online conference on philosophy, religion, and classical German philosophy, organized by the Society of Systematic Philosophy. My name is Emre Ebetürk, and I am the current secretary of the society. Let me use this opportunity to quickly show you our website. Wait, it's not here, sorry. Let me first open it up. Yeah, okay, this is the new website of our society, the Society for Systematic Philosophy.org. Please check out this website and consider becoming a member so we can organize more events together. Today we have a book panel with 3 participants, Gregory Moss, Nahum Brown, and Alessandro de Cesaris. And we are going to discuss Gregory Moss's latest book, Hegel's Foundation-Free Metaphysics, The Logic of Singularity, which came out with Routledge in 2020. Let me say a few words about Greg Moss and the book. Professor Moss is an assistant professor of philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Georgia in August 2014. He was a student of Richard Dean Winfield. And Greg is among my favorite Hegel scholars of our time, although his interests go beyond classical German philosophy and include ancient Greek philosophy and Eastern philosophy, as well as philosophy of religion and mysticism. His first book came out in 2014 with the title Ernst Cassirer and the Autonomy of Language. And in 2018, together with Robert Scott, he edited a book with the title The Significance of Indeterminacy, Perspectives from Asian and Continental Philosophy, where you can read papers from both Greg Moss and Nahum Brown, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And Greg is also the translator of Marcus Gabriel's Why the World Does Not Exist. So, and now let me briefly introduce you to his fascinating book. Let me share my screen again to show you the book description. Should be. Oops. Oops. Sorry, that was the wrong one.
That's not my book.
Yeah.
It's a little different.
Yeah. Okay, it's here.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah, it came out with Routledge, as I said. And let me read the book description. Contemporary philosophical discourse has deeply problematized the possibility of absolute existence. Hegel's foundation-free metaphysics demonstrates that by reading Hegel's doctrine of the concept in the science of logic as a form of absolute dialetheism, Hegel's logic of the concept can account for the possibility of absolute existence. Through a close examination of Hegel's concept of self-referential universality in his science of logic, Moss demonstrates how Hegel's concept of singularity is designed to solve a host of metaphysical and epistemic paradoxes central to this problematic. He illustrates how Hegel's revolutionary account of universality, particularity, and singularity offers solutions to 6 problems that have plagued the history of Western philosophy: the problem of nihilism, the problem of instantiation, the problem of the missing difference, the problem of absolute empiricism, the problem of ontotheology, and the third man regress. Moss shows that Hegel's affirmation and development of a revised ontological argument for God's existence is designed to establish the necessity of absolute existence. By adopting a metaphysical reading of Richard Dean Winfield's foundation-free epistemology, Moss critically engaged dominant readings and contemporary debates in Hegel scholarship. I mean, I personally read the book and published a review on it, and I will tell you all to find and read it. It's an outstanding contribution to Hegelian scholarship. It covers an enormous ground, and it does a great job in clarifying Hegel's doctrine of the concept, which is something Hegel scholarship probably needs to have more. Hegel's concept of the concept sits at the heart of his system, but I personally think that not enough effort is given to appreciate its meaning. So Greg's book is undoubtedly a work that deserves extensive discussion, and that is what we would like to do here. So let me introduce our first commentator, Alessandro de Cesaris. He's joining from Turin, I think. Is that right?
Actually from Paris, Emery.
Okay, right now you're in Paris. Okay, he's a postdoc research fellow at the University of Turin and a scientific collaborator at the Department of Digital Humanism at the Collège de Bernardin in Paris. And he studied in Italy, in Germany, and in France. And his main focuses are philosophy of technology, media theory, and ontology, with particular reference to Greek metaphysics and to classical German philosophy. Alessandro, thank you for participating in our event. And now let me give you the word. After you're done, Greg can address your points, and then around 8 p.m. in Hong Kong, I assume, right? We can have a 5-minute break before moving on with Nahum Brahm's commentary. Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Emery, for the presentation, and thank you all for taking different parts of your Saturday to listen to me, and many thanks to Gregory for inviting me to discuss this beautiful book. I will say now and not say it later. It is an outstanding book. I really think it is a major contribution. I'm absolutely in resonance with what Emre said about Gregory's work. It is a major piece of Hegelian scholarship, and I really look forward to discuss it together with you all and with Greg. And I'm also preparing 2 reviews of the book, so this will also be quite important for me to know what to write and to test to clarify some aspects of the book I want to discuss with you all today. I will start by sharing my screen because I prepared a little presentation. It's not really essential, but it's something better to see than my face. I hope you should see it if I'm not mistaken, right? Great. So as Emery said, I am a postdoc scholar in Turin and Paris. I actually wrote my PhD dissertation on Hegel's notion of singularity in Hegel's logic. Right now I'm preparing a book on the notion of singularity in Hegel's philosophy. So I was, of course, really enthusiastic of knowing that there was a book coming out on the topic, and I'm really glad that it came out before I published my book, because now I can use it extensively and consider it in my work. I more generally am interested in developing a theory of mediation. What interests me in Hegel's philosophy is the account of mediation, and I also use Hegel's notion of mediation with regard to technology, to what is called media theory. So I'm interested in a speculative discussion of Hegel's theory of mediation, of Hegel's metaphysics, but I am also interested in possible ways to use this speculative theory in order to clarify some aspects of today's philosophy of technology. Just to give you, so to say, a framework to comprehend my starting point in reading the book. What I'd like to do in this presentation, I will give a small introduction. So as you know, the book is huge. It's really extensive. And there is a big first part that, so to say, lays the groundwork in order to discuss Hegel's philosophy. I will give a small introduction about what to me is the problem of the relationship between philosophy and singularity in general. Then I will say something about the way Hegel has been, so to say, read and understood with reference to the relationship between systematic philosophy and singularity. Right after that, I will highlight some aspects of the book that maybe are fundamental in order to understand what I'd like to discuss together with you all. And finally, I will ask 4 questions. Maybe, I don't know if I will have the time. In case, in order to confirm the stereotype, I will stop to the third one. It is also always very Hegelian to stop to number 3. So we will see whether I will manage to ask all 4 or stop to the third one. So first of all, I'd like to point out that since Plato, the relationship between philosophy and singularity has been complicated, even paradoxical. On the one hand, philosophy has been constantly depicted as the kind of knowledge that addresses the universal and not the singular. And tradition offers us a bunch of formulas in order to clarify this taxonomy. While philosophy is knowledge of the universal, art or history, for instance, do know what is singular or have as object singularity. While thought only grasps the universal, only intuition has access to the singularity of things. On the other hand, however, philosophy has always been obsessed with singularity. The greater part of the philosophical effort since Plato and Aristotle is devoted precisely to understand how singular beings are structured, how they are generated, how we think and say things about them, how they do relate to each other. It is clear now that I'm using singular in a very, very generic way now. So while the singular or the individual, since we are going very generic, is banned from the domain of philosophy, nonetheless, philosophy's main task has always been the discovery and the elaboration of the structure of singularity itself. But what is singularity? Even the question, along with the distinction between singular and universal, is quite problematic. We are accustomed to identify singularity as the lower limit of thought, namely as what lies beyond any possible specific difference in the great taxonomy of genus and species. Yet, what is singular is also what lies beyond the upper limit of thought, namely what exceeds any possible genus. Plato's formula "Epikeina tesousias" is an example of this position. In a sense, so singular is the opposite of universal. In another sense, singular is the opposite of plural. I know this is a schematic simplification, but this could be accounted as the main difference between Aristotle and Plato, for instance. According to Plato, ideas are the true singulars, are the true individuals. There is only one beauty. It is one, eternal, well-determinate, whereas sensible things are always plural, changing, indeterminate, and temporal. Empirical beings are not really singular. Aristotle's attempt to save phenomena, to use a formula created by Simplicius, who also Ernst Cassirer loved, as Gregory knows, is precisely the attempt to think sensible things as singular things, determinate beings, kathekaston in Greek. Again, I know this is an oversimplification, but for the sake of discussion, maybe it could be useful to identify this basic difference between a Platonic and an Aristotelian attitude towards singularity. On the one side, singular is the absolute. On the other side, the singular is first and foremost finite individual being. Now, how do we place Hegel's philosophy in this frame? First of all, it is worth mentioning that Hegel's thought has traditionally been accused of a complete lack of interest for singularity. Hegel is the philosopher of universality par excellence, and in his thought, singularity is accounted for only as a moment of totality and of universality. I don't know, for instance, in Kentama Yasu latest works, which Gregory also discusses in the book, this is precisely the case. Yes, Hegel does account for the contingent and the singular, but it is only to reabsorb it into totality and into universality. Again, Gianni Vattimo in Turin contraposes, so to say, Hegel's philosophy with Schleiermacher's philosophy as a philosophy of individuality and singularity. So in Turin, for instance, there is much opposition to Hegelian philosophy because hermeneutic is viewed as a philosophy of singularity in opposition to Hegelian dialectics. Now, already after Hegel's death, his first commentators criticized Hegel's disregard for singularity. I will quote 3 examples, and the first one is Ludwig Feuerbach, that according to whom the distinction between logical and sensible being is the inescapable mark of Hegel's failure in thinking the individual. And here, so I quoted a citation, die Sprache gehört hier gar nicht zur Sache. Die Realität des sinnlichen einzelnen Seins ist uns eine mit unserem Blute besiegelte Wahrheit. So this idea that in this proposition is hidden the idea that logic cannot account for singularity. That's the basic idea. Again, the strongest critic of Hegel's philosophy of singularity, of course, is Siren Kirkegaard, who polemically used the term der Einzelne throughout his philosophy, precisely to rescue the singular from Hegel's monistic and universalistic account of philosophy. He talked about himself as the Einzelne, precisely to oppose Hegel's philosophy. And again, I quote one sentence, maybe it can be useful for the discussion. What does it mean for abstract thought to ask what reality is its existence, since abstraction does abstract precisely from existence? And this is a part of the unscientific postscript. This is all written right a few years after Hegel's death. Now, this interpretation of Hegel's philosophy has survived up to contemporary philosophy. In particular, French thought used the term singularity in order to develop an anti-Platonic and anti-Hegelian concept of individuality. Here I have a quote from Gilles Deleuze, who's the philosopher that expresses this critique in the most explicit way. So I read, Hegel substitutes the abstract relation of the particular to the concept in general for the true relation of the singular and the universal in the idea. It is quite ironic that while Hegel is one of the first philosophers to use the notion of singularity in a technical, speculative fashion, the whole post-structuralist tradition in France, and for instance, also post-Simondonians philosophers such as, I don't know, Bernard Stiegler, for instance, use the term singular as an anti-Hegelian notion, tracing it back to Spinoza in contraposition with Hegelian dialectic. Now, a second element I would like to point out is that this criticism of Hegel's notion of singularity goes along with a critique of Hegel's systematic and anti-foundational idea of philosophy. Feuerbach and Kierkegaard, but also many other early commentators of Hegel's system, for instance, Karl Werder, Kuno Fischer, Schelling, Friedrich Trendelenburg, criticized Hegel's disregard for the individual, and at the same time denounced the impossibility to obtain a complex categorical structure starting from the absolute simplicity of being. In other terms, they denounced the impossibility to get difference starting from identity. And I find it interesting, for the sake of the discussion about Greg's book, that these two criticisms always go together. They criticize Hegel's disregard for individuality, for singularity, and they criticize, so to say, the Hegelian need to find difference in identity. Now, this relationship between systematic metaphysics and the problem of singularity is really important in order to describe one of the specific merits of Gregory Moss' book, in my opinion, one of its greatest merits. So the so-called Hegel Renaissance in the English-speaking area has brought a new evaluation of Hegel's account of individual entities. I believe that Paul Redding highlighted in the clearest way how the Pittsburgh school, so McDowell, but in particular Brandom, has managed to read Hegel's philosophy as a semantic theory of individuation, giving thus new resonance to Hegel's interest for individual beings, so to say. However, these interpretations have systematically underplayed the metaphysical, systematic aspect of Hegel's thought, along with its strictly metaphysical character. So to say, Brandam's inferentialism is an Aristotelian reading of Hegel's theory of singularity, according to the model I proposed as an oversimplification at the beginning of my presentation, since it understands singular beings only as finite individual objects. In my opinion, the book we are discussing today is very important precisely because it highlights some aspects of Hegel's philosophy that have been structurally neglected by many commentators. And I will mention three, and I don't know whether Gregory agrees, but we can discuss about it. So first of all, Hegel's notion of singularity does not only refer to individual finite beings, but also, I would also say prominently, to that peculiar singular being that is the absolute. So to say, Hegel's use of the notion of singularity is both Platonic and Aristotelian, according to the sketch I proposed. Second point, it is impossible to understand Hegel's use of the notion of singularity without taking into account the necessary structural relationship between these two accounts, between these two dimensions. So there is no account of the singularity of finite being without addressing the singularity of the absolute. This is one of the really one of the main points. Third aspect, it is impossible to understand Hegel's use of the notion of singularity without taking into account the metaphysical character of Hegel's logic. This is a consequence of the second point, so to say. And here it is important to apply some, it is very important in order to discuss this third point, not to apply some understanding of the term metaphysics from the outside. So for instance, to take it from the contemporary debate, or to ask ourselves whether, I don't know, Hegel's philosophy is an ontology or a metaphysics in the way how metaphysics and ontology are described today in the contemporary debate. So it is very important not to apply the meaning of this term from the outside, but rather to recognize Hegel's own account of the notion of metaphysics, because the problem is precisely that this account is, so to say, part of the issue. Hegel's development of his notion of metaphysics is strictly related to the problem of the relationship between singularity and universality. Now, one of the most striking elements of Gregory's book is that it emphasizes the strict close relationship between infinite and finite thought. While tradition generally accepted that we cannot think the absolute in the same way we think finite being, this is so to say a topos, a general topos of the history of philosophy. One of the key contributions of classic German philosophy, as Gregory reconstructs it by discussing the problem of nihilism, for instance, is the idea that if we fail to think the absolute, even thinking finite being becomes impossible. If I'm not misunderstood, so this is, so to say, the core element at stake in the discussion of the problem of nihilism. And I won't go into it in detail, but a general consequence of this approach is precisely what I've called unity of Platonic and Aristotelian approach. If the absolute is absolute, and therefore there is nothing outside of it, then it is impossible to differentiate between two faculties or two methods as if, for instance, understanding were to be identified with the faculty of finite being and reason with the faculty of absolute being, considered both either from the epistemological or ontological point of view. I absolutely resonate with Gregory's decision to, so to say, to consider the epistemological and the ontological aspect in their unity. So by developing a critical discussion of how the absolute has been taught in the metaphysical tradition, we are at the same time questioning the way we think finite being. And in the book, Gregory identifies two main problems in the history of metaphysics, so to say. So the duality of principles and the impossibility of self-reference. There is also a third issue, naming the assumption of the truth of the principle of non-contradiction, but it occupies a different place. So I don't know whether Greg agrees, but so to say, the problem about the principle of non-contradiction is a second-level issue with respect to these two basic dilemmas. And these two assumptions, which we can find throughout the history of metaphysics, generate 5 paradoxes. I have listed them. We have so I have tried to, so to say, summarize them in one sentence. I won't do it now. I don't believe it's particularly important since we have all read the book, but I will only read the first one because maybe it is the one where I've taken most liberty, so to say. For instance, the problem of instantiation is precisely the idea that if we have two different sources in order to know and in order to describe particulars and universal, then if they obey to different principles, then it's impossible to clarify their relationship. And here comes what I would like to, let's go there. Here I would ask the first question. So we have these 5 paradoxes, and what I have found really interesting in the book is that in the book you do not use prominently a strategy that is being used by many commentators in describing these issues, namely the difference between understanding and reason, so to say. You discuss this difference, of course. It is one of the topic of the book towards the end, but when you list and analyze these paradoxes, these problems, you do not immediately refer to the difference between, so to say, understanding and reason. What is not clear to me, and I'd like to know what you think about it, is whether these issues could be addressed as the result of an intellectualistic and non-speculative understanding of the domain of conceptuality. So what I'd like to know is whether this strategy could work. And I ask this because it seems to me that without the need to record to their, so to say, systematic origin as Gregory does, these paradoxes do stem from an utterly intellectualistic understanding of conceptuality. I mean, there is the danger that we could address these problems and we could, so to say, address these dilemmas without referring to the issues, to the two assumptions Gregory listed, but simply by showing how an intellectualistic approach to conceptuality works. So I would like to know what Gregory thinks about this. For instance, and here I am forcing and radicalizing the issue in order to help the discussion, so to say. The problem of the missing difference. Couldn't it be analyzed as a specific formulation of a more general issue that concerned, for instance, British and Italian idealism for a long time, namely how the very form of judgment can be understood without contradiction? Because in the end, since every judgment, as Kant states in his lectures on logic, is in the form the singular is universal, and since the singular is not universal, isn't this already a case of contradiction or of precisely the same kind you describe when you describe the dilemma of missing difference. So this is a first, so to say, meta question. There are all these issues, these 5 problems, so to say, are all present in the history of philosophy, and the book often retraces some historical instances of the discussion. For instance, I don't know, the first 2 problems are addressed by quoting many passages from Plato's Parmenides and the book Beta of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Now, another issue I have is that both the Parmenides and the book Beta are, so to say, conceived by Plato and Aristotle as partes destruentes, so to say, as critical preliminary moments that are designed to give space to a new theory that is present in other parts of their work. For instance, I don't know, Plato's Sophistes or Plato's Sophist and the other books of Aristotle's Metaphysics. So my question again is, and I put it in the form of a question, not because I mean it's not a criticism. It's really I'd really like to know, to have a clarification on this, because, for instance, it is again the same question: is the difference between understanding and reason not a good way to indicate the source of these paradoxes? And if so, do we not find throughout the history of philosophy examples of speculative overcoming of these paradoxes? So, for instance, I don't know, Plato's generative account of the koinonia ton genon, of the common supreme genus in the Sophist, is it still subject to these paradoxes? This is what I would ask Gregory, because, for instance, in that theory, in the Sophist, the self-referential character of ideas is no longer problematic to Plato. So again, I'd like to know what you think about this. Also, I started out we were studying Greek thought, so I'm really interested in the, so to say, in the way Gregory uses Greek philosophy in order to discuss Hegel. It's also a methodology I deeply resonate with. I have maybe a much more Aristotelian account of Hegel than he does, but again, this is very, very, very interesting. Another aspect of the Sophist, for instance, I'd like to point out is that, again, in the Sophist, the self-referential character of ideas is no longer problematic, but with respect to the Parmenides, it is also not trivialized by referencing empirical concepts. This is one of the main issues, for instance. I mean, when you discuss the Parmenides, maybe you underplay the rhetoric element of Parmenides and Zeno's criticism of Socrates' theory of ideas. More generally, since the book has a very strong historical foundation, I'd like to ask Gregory about the relationship between his reconstruction and Hegel's own history of philosophy. This is maybe another interesting aspect of the book I'd like to illuminate, because, for instance, following Alfredo Ferrarin, you concede that Aristotle's metaphysics is speculative and belongs, so to say, to the domain of the concept. But then how can we integrate the idea, so this assumption that Hegel is a philosopher of the concept, with the paradoxes of Aristotle's account of conceptuality that you point out in your reconstruction? Because I have the impression that when you discuss these paradoxes, you give a very utterly, so to say, intellectualistic account of Aristotle's philosophy. And I'd like to know how you see the questions. So I have the 4 questions. I already know I will stop to number 3, because the 4th one is huge and I won't even ask it. But I have 4 specific topics in the book I would like to ask you about. So the book is really huge. There is days worth of topics to discuss. There are many brilliant analyses. I do agree with many of them. I have some issues with other, But I try to avoid discussing particular matters, specific passages of the book, or so to say, singular interpretations of specific authors, because I don't know, maybe it's not really important. I'd like to keep the debate on the more general and fundamental level and discuss some structural aspects of the book rather than specific questions. So first of all, and I finally can use my slides. So first question, what kind of metaphysics are we talking about? So in the final part of the book, you thoroughly discuss different metaphysical and non-metaphysical accounts of Hegel's logic. In particular, you also highlight Hegel's intention to reform metaphysics beyond any dogmatic understanding of it. Now, what I would like to ask you is to spend maybe a few more words on this topic. And the reason for it is that my impression is that this problem is deeply connected with a major aspect of your book, namely the relationship between logic, nature, and spirit. Now, as we know, that one of the main arguments of the book is that Hegel's logic introduces a self-referential and self-differentiating account of the concept. Now, in my opinion, this aspect of Hegel's logic, I don't know whether you agree, is also the main focus of Hegel's own auto-reformation of logic in the second edition of the Doctrine of Being, because there is where he stresses that objective logic already is, so to say, subjective logic in disguise, so to say. Now, this problem is also the problem of the formal character of logic. According to Hegel, logic is not formal, and this is, so to say, my formulation, because it has logical forms as its own content. Logical forms are at the same time form and content of the logical enterprise. So to say, it is a noesis noesios in this way. I'd like to discuss with you this quote I took from the Science of Logic. So, but logical reason itself, the substantial or real factor, which within itself holds together all the abstract determinations and constitutes their proper, absolutely concrete unity. There is no need, therefore, to look far and wide for what is usually called a matter. It is not the fault of the subject matter of logic if the latter seems empty, but only of the manner in which the subject matter is grasped. Now, Elena Ficara, which you quote in your book, has analyzed this passage more than once in many different articles, and she illuminates it as an example of Hegel's criticism of the formalistic character of the logic of its time. What I would like to ask you is, what is the limit of this self-determining process? The logic is a self-generating structure, a self-generating process through which the concept determines itself as concept. But while we discover a great variety of conceptual determinations, these determinations never become empirical. So in other terms, the logical development of the category of quality never generates the concept of color, for instance. In other words, what does never happen is what Fichte talks about, for instance, in his lectures about the Tatsachen des Bewusstseins, namely the idea that from a first principle, I must be able to deduce everything, even this blade of grass, writes Fichte. And it is the same conception of systematic metaphysics that Wilhelm Krug, for instance, presents against Hegel and Schelling as a criticism to idealism, namely that we have to be able to deduce everything from logic. And this is a prospect that Hegel ridicules explicitly. Now, for instance, when Hegel talks about the ontological proof, I'm naturally brought to believe that, so to say, in no way Hegel is talking about the existence of God. What Hegel is saying is that the concept has logical objectivity. And in my opinion, a very important difference, and I'm not sure about this, it's really a problematic aspect, is precisely the determination of this difference between existence, logical objectivity, being, and so on. So, and in my opinion, this is the great difference between Hegelian and precritic metaphysics. And I'd like to know you about, I'd like to hear more from you about this. Second question, what kind of singularity are we talking about? So I've started my presentation by sketching two attitudes, so to say, towards the notion of singularity. Now, I have said that, if I'm not mistaken, in your book is clearly stated that each category of the logic cannot be used exclusively to think the absolute, since the absolute is not separated from finite being. Therefore, singularity does describe both limits of thought, so to say, the absolute and singular finite beings. However, I have the impression, I don't know whether you agree, that your book has a slightly Platonic tendency. So you do lean towards the Platonic understanding of singularity. Namely, you are, for obvious reason, and I also agree with them, you are more interested in showing how singularity expresses the logical structure of the absolute, rather than how singularity can be used to express the being of finite individual things. Now, I would like to ask you to tell us more about the other extremes, so to say. More specifically, for instance, Hegel writes that singularity is the principle of every individuality and personality. Now, I was interested in knowing whether you have an idea of how this relationship between singularity, individuality, and personality is structured, because, for instance, this is a huge philological problem. Einzelheit has been translated by many, both in English and in Italian, as individuality. So this difference between singularity and individuality has been long kept unexpressed, so to say. And another problem about singularity, which I don't know if you agree with me, but Hegel uses the term Einzel, or the Einzelheit, Vereinzelung. There are two uses, so to say, of this term. There is a commonsensical use of this term, which we can find throughout Hegel's work, so to say, and there is, so to say, a technical, speculative use of the term singularity that you brilliantly analyze in your book. I am also interested in knowing whether you agree with this, and whether you see, so to say, a relationship between these two uses of the term, because I'm under the impression that Einzel is, so to say, a term like Sinn. So it's one of those terms that have that are inherently dialectic, because they mean something at its opposite, namely precisely. So individual things and the absolute. Third point, the relationship between syllogism and inference. This is an aspect that really surprised me in the final part of the book, in a good way. I mean, I'm really curious about it, namely your treatment of syllogism. So usually judgment and syllogism are analyzed as logical developments of the abstract concept in the doctrine of the concept. And I do believe that Hegel also expressly indicates them as such in the science of logic. Nevertheless, again, if I read correctly, you do interpret judgment and syllogism as a logically impoverished form of the first section about the concept. Namely, you describe them as forms of self-alienation of the concept. Now, my first question is, my first sub-question is, how do you read the beginning of the section on the syllogism, where Hegel writes that, and I quote, "Thus the syllogism is the completely posited concept. It is therefore the rational." So how do you, so to say, reconcile this idea with your interpretation? And more generally, Hegel is quite obsessive about the syllogistic character of, so to say, the absolute in his system. The end of the encyclopedia is maybe the strongest example. Again, I'd love to know more about this, because you don't discuss it in the book, and I mean, it's the obvious objection I'd like to make. A second element that I'd like to highlight is maybe a small criticism. I don't know whether you agree. I completely agree with your criticism of Robert Brandon's account of Hegel's philosophy as a form of inferentialism. Incidentally, I'd like to point out, since we're talking about systematic philosophy, and Nahum Brown is also interested in nihilism, and I mean, it is the right place to talk about it. That, for instance, Francesco Berto, who you also quote, has endorsed Brandon's inferentialism by, so to say, enhancing it with another source, the thought of an Italian philosopher named Emanuele Severino. He taught in Venice. Berto studied in Venice, and Severino has recently died, but a couple of years ago he had a very nice debate with Graham Priest about contradiction and truth, and he's the most prominent expression of Italian neo-idealism, and I really think that his way of doing philosophy would deeply resonate with your book, and in general with your way of understanding philosophy in this strong systematic sense. Unfortunately, he writes in Italian, but one of his main books is translated in English. It's called The Essence of Nihilism. I don't know whether you know about it, but again, it's just a suggestion. I was really struck by how much your approach reminded me of Emanuele Severino. My criticism instead is that by criticizing Brandon, maybe you start from the same assumption, that syllogism is that syllogism is inference. So, namely, that when Hegel speaks about syllogism, he's always talking about a formal structure of reasoning. Now, I do not think this is the case, because, for instance, in a passage you quote, Hegel notably writes that all things are a syllogism, and you stop there. But right after, he says, all things are a syllogism, a universal united through particularity with singularity. Surely not a whole made up of three propositions. And I agree with you that Hegel heavily criticizes the form of inference, even in the lectures on the history of philosophy. But I also believe that in this passage is very clearly stating that we must distinguish the subjective form of inference from the logical objective form of syllogistic unity. The last question was about contradiction, but it's really a huge one, and I will leave it for the discussion. I already taken all my time, so thank you for listening to me, and I hope this can start a proper discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you, Alessandro. Yeah, if we have more time, I think you can later raise your last question. But now
Absolutely.
I'd like to give the word to Greg to hear his comments before we give our 5-minute break.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex, for your very thoughtful comments and for taking the time to work through my text. It's a great privilege to have someone read your book and then to have comments about the book, especially in philosophy when almost no one reads the books in the first place. So anyway, so there's so much here, and maybe I have 10 minutes. So let me briefly say a few things, and hopefully we can talk at greater length together one-on-one about a lot of the issues that are already quite fruitful for me. So let's begin with the discussion of understanding and reason. I think that's also a legitimate way to indicate the source of the paradox. And I think that's another alternative formulation that I could have used. I do mention the terms briefly in a couple places, but you're right. They don't function as, say, the key terms in my own articulation of the paradoxes themselves. Surely the contradiction is there in judgment, like you said. And I take this to be, let me let Cecilia in. She's joining us. 1 second, sorry. She's joining a little late, but she's coming. Oh, all right, sorry about that. There's a place in the logic where Hegel talks about judgment as unable to express speculative content. So I take that to be one element of the contradiction, namely the judgment is there. It is a part of the speculative content, but it is a speculative content outside of itself. So I think it's exactly right that the contradiction is there in judgment. And so yeah, I totally agree with that point. Let me say something about the Plato and the Aristotle, because you're exactly right that there is, within both Plato and Aristotle, you're right that I do focus in large part on the preliminary reflections, like Aristotle's discussions of are the sources one in kind or one in number? And then there's a paradox on both ends. And then, of course, the introduction to Parmenides is, young Socrates is getting schooled by the elder philosopher, right? So he's learning how to do philosophy, right? So that's all admitted. And I agree with you that that there is precedent for the solution to the paradoxes already in Plato and in Aristotle. But let me say something about how what I think the limits are of using those thinkers. So, for example, let's just stay with Parmenides since I discuss it at greater length. In the second part, when we go through the hypotheses, right? You get something like a self-particularizing universal, where you'll have, for example, the one being. I think it's the second one, right? There's the one being, and the one is, and the being is one. And so the one being is being in one, and the being is one in being, right? And so what you have is this self-differentiating totality, and you have it there in the second part of the Parmenides. So I think actually Plato already had something like, at least in some form, we could debate what the status of those deductions are. And I think that's a big debate in Plato's scholarship. Parmenides it's a very difficult text to interpret. What's really going on? Is this a metaphysical theory? Is it logical erudition? I mean, what is it, right? But you do have something like a template, or you could say a solution to the paradoxes that is prefigured, even if it doesn't really live up to Hegel's dialectical understanding, because it's still beginning with, well, assumptions like the one being or the one is, right? So I very much agree with that. There's just not enough pages. Routledge wouldn't let me. I wanted to publish 200 more pages on top of the 500, and they said, sorry, kid. No one's going to read it anyway because it's 500 pages, but 700 is even, it's not going to happen. Second point is, I agree actually that there's a lot of Aristotle there in Hegel, but I think one can overplay it. And I think if you overplay it, you miss what is distinct about what Hegel's doing. So for example, I do think that Aristotle has a view of form that generates particulars. So form, the way I understand it, is being at work. It's being at work, staying itself, but that work that it does generates, in my view, composites. So the form is a principle of motion. That's one of Aristotle's critiques of Plato, is that the forms don't account for motion. They also don't seem to account for generation. But Aristotle wants to give an account of that. So I think that's something that you see in Hegel, that we have the concept is at work, and it's the way that it prefer the term creating, actually, creating particulars. So I think there's something analogous going on. And that's why I would class Aristotle in the domain of the speculative, as you rightly pointed out. But I think that there's a key difference. And one of the key, there's many, but one of the key differences is, for Aristotle, the form is being at work, staying itself. And I think in Aristotle, so that's, entelecheia. But for Hegel, it's being at work exceeding itself. So the way I view it, and it stays itself in virtue of exceeding itself. So it's always exceeding itself at every point, but it stays itself in virtue of that self-exceeding. And so that's where I think it's radically anti-Aristotelian, and actually it undermines fundamentally what Aristotle is doing. So it's both Aristotelian, but in the first sense that I mentioned. And we need to acknowledge that and rescue Aristotle from some kind of facile empiricism that he didn't advocate. But on the other hand, he doesn't have this idea of dialectics, whereby the particulars are generated through the self-exceeding of the form. not say staying at the limit and not overstepping it. I think that's a fundamental difference that needs to be really recognized. And I think that's too much Aristotle in the Hegel. You miss all of that. And I think that's a big risk. So there's my anti-Aristotelianism there for you. Okay. But it's a point well taken. So many good questions. Oh no, it's already 8 o'clock. Okay, let me say a few things. What kind of metaphysics? So let's go down here. Yeah, you had a question about the ontological proof. You read it as a concept, as logical objectivity. I think at least that is right, but maybe more. And maybe you got that sense reading my book, is that I want it to be more than that. Maybe you kind of got that sense. I may have even said that it is more than that, but it at least involves the concept as determining its own, or being the source of its own logical objectivity or its own logical being, right? Although I do want to say that, you know, once you get to the end of the logic, you have this moment whereby the logic itself becomes logical. And when the logic itself becomes logical, logic itself becomes one of the moments of logic. And when that happens, the logic is outside of itself. It exceeds itself. And then you have something like the self-externality of the logic, which we'll talk about as nature. So as far as I can see, the ontological argument is basically that the concept is self-particularizing. That's basically how I understand it. The concept is responsible for its own particularization. And so there we have the kind of natural affinity with the so-called ontological argument in the history of metaphysics. But this self-particularization, as far as I can see, can't stop with logic, because as Hegel points out, it goes to nature. Logic makes itself natural. And I take that to be really Hegel's view. Logic determines itself to be logical, then negates its merely logical character and posits itself as nature. And my view is pretty robust. I don't think it's just the determination of nature. I think he really means nature. And I try to give, so nature and the determination of nature. So I try to give some citations that actually prove that that's what his view is. And I think it's actually what's called for. Now, whether it's successful or works is another question. And I'm not really dealing with it in the book, because I'm just trying to figure out the logic, or at least these 3 categories, right? Allgemeinheit, Besonderheit, Einzelheit. So it took 500 pages to do 3 categories, but maybe a future book. I think that's a really important question. What is the relation of logic to nature and spirit? And I've tended to think about those as different forms of the self-particularization of the concept. So you could think about the concept particularizing itself as logic, as nature, as spirit, and then you have the totality of logic, nature, and spirit compromising the absolute. So those aren't the only categories at play, obviously, but they are, I think, essential categories. Okay, let me really briefly, I really liked how you pointed out that the singular has both of these senses, of the absolute and the individual finite being. That's something that was, I think, really important for me. You put it in your own words, which is very helpful. And hopefully some people can then connect some of the ideas as they're presented in the book with some of these historical accounts of singularity, and also ways that it's spoken about. But that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is to show that the singular, that you really can't account for it without appealing to both of these aspects of it. And then finally, the syllogism and the inference, a very articulate critique, well taken. So let me start by saying, I think you're right, that in general, I have, one could say, a rhetorical, maybe polemical project here, as well as a systematic one. And that is to really, one could say, highlight the dialectical self-developing aspect, and to downplay this idea that in Hegel's thought, we have a bunch of different philosophers giving and taking reasons and exchanging ideas, that's not what's going on. So I think that was kind of the force of those claims about this, about inference and syllogism, are aimed towards, one could say, maybe pushing it a bit too far in my polemicizing. Namely to basically say that viewing Hegel as an inferentialist is fundamentally misguided. And I think the text speaks for itself. The fact that someone has to write a book to make the claim itself is a concern, I would say. But I think your point's very well taken, that everything is a syllogism. And then as you pointed out, there is a way in which the system itself is not subjectively, as you put it, syllogistic, but it has an essential place that shouldn't be denied. And I actually think this is connected up with the idea that the abstract is the soul of the concept. So Hegel says that abstraction is the soul of the concept, which is surprising at first because you think, wait, I thought the abstraction was, say, it's the common term, it doesn't differentiate itself. So how could it be the soul? Shouldn't the soul be the self-differentiating universal? And I think part of the idea here is that without the abstraction, the genus, the set, without these forms of determinate universality, the universal doesn't have content. It actually needs these forms of finitude. It needs what I've called the self-externality or the self-alienating dimension in order to have content. So actually, even though I say it's the universal in its self-alienated form, it's a self-alienation inherently motivated by the self-development of the concept. And in that way, it isn't grounded on, say, a premise that is, say, unjustified as a foundation or something like that. So I think there's a way for me to really accommodate the point that you make, but it's a very important point, and it highlights, one could say, one of the more polemical sides of my text. So there's a lot more to say about that than I've said. But I think that one of the risks when we read Hegel is that we just see the clothes, as Hegel says. There's the right where what we see are the words, we see the judgments, we see the propositions. And we don't see, one could say, the animating spirit that generates those judgments, that generates those forms. And I think part of the risk is then, this is what I call the absolutizing of particularity, which I think is one of the more common, I would say, mistakes of the Anglo-American readings. But they're not just mistakes. There's truth in it. There's truth in it. And that's one of the really profound ideas that I take from Hegel, is that the error is necessary and the error is instructive. And I think that's one of the more cosmopolitan dimensions of it. And so for this reason, it's the error itself, one could say, is also central to the self-development of the concept. That's this moment of the true and the false being present there. So that's a lot, and it's already 8:07, so I think I'll stop there. I've tried to speak to a number of different points. I think I've skipped a couple, but I've tried to keep track of your very excellent comments, very thorough.
Thank you both. If Alex, if you want to have a very quick follow-up, I can give you 2 minutes, then we can have a break at 8:10 +8.
Thank you, Emery. So basically, I would like to thank Greg for the effort to summarize so much in such a short time. And I agree with almost everything you said. So I deeply resonate with the book. Maybe, yeah, one last remark, because I'm really interested in it. I was really, I found this reference to the clothing of the concept very interesting in your book. And maybe this is, I started out studying Hegel with a Fichte scholar. So with Marco Ivaldo, who's an expert of Fichte's thought. And I believe that this problem of the relationship between, so to say, the discursive form of truth and truth itself, which I will maybe we could call the pragmatic aspect of truth, namely the paradoxes we incur in when we try and say truth, speak the truth, so to say, is an essential element of Fichte's philosophy. I believe Fichte devoted much more effort than Hegel to discussing this specific problem of philosophy, and it is really interesting that you emphasize it in Hegel's thought, because it's not often a main element of the discussion. So I also deeply agree with the importance of what you just said. Absolutely. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say just one comment. Yeah, Fichte probably deserves even more attention than I give in the book. I mostly focus on him in regard to this question about synthesis and analysis, whether the first principle can be synthetic or not. But I think there's so much more to explore in Fichte. Many of the points that you just raised obviously are important issues. There's a lot of other ones too, actually, that I don't have time for. The same thing can be said about Schelling, actually. I have a lot of really strong interest in Schelling, and in a way I feel bad that I only discussed his early work, because his freedom essay and the stuff that comes later is really fascinating and is really pertinent for a lot of the issues that I've discussed. So I hope that none of the Schelling scholars takes it too personally that I just move on to Hegel so quickly. He certainly deserves more attention, as does Fichte.
I do believe that one really important aspect of your book is also this one, from the point of view of, so to say, Hegelian scholarship. I believe we are past that time in scholarship where there are Hegel scholar, Fichte scholar, Schelling scholars, and they all are, so to say, playing against each other. And we should really start studying classic German philosophy as a whole. And I think your book is a really good example that goes in that direction.
One last thing, Emre, and then we'll stop. Yeah, I'm sorry, Emre, I'm going over this a little bit. I think one of the things that binds them all together, and this is a question that I think is generally overlooked, is how does the infinite become finite? That's the question everyone asks. Fichte asked that question, Schelling asked the question, Schlegel asked the question, Hegel asked the question. Everyone wants to know, right? And it's a unifying question, right? And they all have fundamental disagreements. They fall out with each other in various ways because they have a common problem, right? And that's why we belong together as a community. This is maybe I want everyone to come to the table because we have a common question. We just disagree about how to answer it, or whether it is even a question that's legitimately formulated in the first place, which I think Hegel himself critiques the question in the way that it's formulated, since he makes the finite come before the infinite. So, and anyway, I'll just stop there. But
yeah. I mean, I wish we were all in Germany discussing all these things, interesting topics together. Yeah. Well, let's have a 5-minute break, and then we will be back at 17 past 8, I think, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
So it's about time, I think. Welcome back, everyone. Let me introduce you our second commentator. Nahum Brown is a professor of philosophy at Miyazaki International College in Miyazaki, Japan. Obviously, he's also interested in classical German philosophy and philosophy of Hegel. He focuses particularly on concepts of modality, potentiality, actuality, indeterminacy. Nahum published 2 books and edited 2 others, as far as I know. Please correct if I'm wrong. I'll show you the beautiful cover of his latest book, Hegel on Possibility, Dialectics, Contradiction, and Modality. It came with Bloomsbury in February 2020.
You'll also, sorry, I wrote an endorsement of the book as well. I just wanted to say that. So
okay.
Buy the book, read the book. Sorry, continue.
Nahum has also published papers in ancient Greek and early modern philosophy and on philosophers such as Heidegger, Agamben, and Derrida. So he has a very wide range of interests. And today we're going to hear his thoughts about Greg's latest book. Okay. Thank you, Nahum, for participating in this event.
Thanks for introducing me. Thanks for having me at the event. It's a real pleasure to connect with you all. I have a short book review that I'm going to read, so I don't think it'll take that much time. So we should have ample time to have more discussion and whatnot. I have a book review that will come out eventually with the Owl of Minerva journal in the US. So this is a draft that I think it's basically done, but maybe you'll have some comments that will cause me to revise, which I think I can still revise. I'm going to share my screen with you just so it's a bit easier for you to read along with me, and I'll just read it. And then I have a broad question for Greg that we'll see how interesting the question is for you, Greg, if you get into it or not. And are you going to present something after me? What is the schedule from here?
Yeah, so after you talk, then I'll try to speak to the question a little bit, and then we can just see what the time looks like. And we can either just talk or just see how it goes.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so this won't take too long. This is only the second book review I've written. I wrote a book review a number of years ago when I was a grad student. And one thing I just want to say, it caused me to kind of think about what is a book review. I remember when I was young, I would read the New York Times book reviews, the weekly review of books a lot. And I noticed that book reviewers were often giving arguments to the public for why this book should be read. And so I tried to think in that way. Like sometimes book reviews can be quite critical, or they can be quite technical or whatnot. But I tried to visualize myself as presenting an argument for, read this book. So here we go. I highly recommend Gregory S. Moss's new book, Hegel's Foundation Free Metaphysics, The Logic of Singularity. I will outline 4 reasons why the book is an outstanding piece of scholarship suitable for advanced readers of Hegel and historians of philosophy generally. These 4 reasons are as follows. 1, Moss's book contributes to Hegelian discussions about the nature of the absolute. 2, it also offers a defense of Hegel's positive treatment of contradiction. 3, Moss does an excellent job of exploring Hegel's critical assessment of non-contradictory thinking and the distortions of reality that occur when we assume that the universal and the particular are fundamentally separate. 4, Moss's book also contains a detailed account of Hegel's conception of singularity, which emerges from a thorough explication of important passages from Hegel's doctrine of the concept. In addition to these four reasons, I will also explore a few consequences and criticisms of Mauss's work by thinking about ways the book could be developed into further projects. Mauss's book focuses on the problem of how to conceive of the absolute. Such an inquiry is one of the most profound yet evasive topics philosophers have been attempting to resolve from the beginnings of recorded history. Such a question led Socrates to engage in philosophical dialogue with the politicians and craftsmen of Athens. This is the same inquiry that led Descartes to doubt everything that could possibly be brought into doubt. And this is the same inquiry that prompted the German idealist response from Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, and others to Kant's transcendental project of recognizing the limits of what can and cannot be known. To approach this topic, Mauss analyzes a number of related questions about the nature of the absolute. Is the first principle analytic or synthetic? Is it grounded in the subject or is it grounded in objective reality? Does the first principle have a specific determinate character, such as Thales's claim that water is the first principle or Heraclitus's claim that fire is the origin of everything? Does the existence of the absolute appear only through a mediating relation, such as only through the Neoplatonic conception of emanation? Are there really two principles at the start? Is there even a first principle at all? Ultimately, is there a way to establish first philosophy without appealing to a preordained foundation of reality? Is there a way to do foundation-free metaphysics? These are some of the big questions that Mauss addresses in his book. In a related way, Mauss's book offers a formidable defense of Hegel's commitment to contradiction. The whole book can be read as a complex, sustained argument meant to support Hegel's conclusion that real contradictions exist. Mauss claims that the only adequate solutions to the problem of the absolute do not assume the principle of non-contradiction, PNC, from the outset. Mauss supports this claim by exploring the various ways that assuming PNC leads to an inadequate conception of first philosophy and the comprehension of the absolute. The absolute, Mauss writes, can only exist and be known by denying that the principle of non-contradiction is a principle governing truth and existence, end quote. Our commitment to the existence of the absolute requires a radical reassessment of our traditional assumptions about the law of non-contradiction and the conventional separation of the universal from the particular. Philosophers who unquestioningly uphold the principle of non-contradiction embrace an assumption that distorts reality and does not let dialectics properly unfold. Likewise, philosophers who assume that the universal must always already appear separated from the particular embrace a distorted view of reality that produces a myriad of paradoxes and illusions. In contrast, Mauss presents Hegel as a philosopher who does not merely disregard PNC for the sake of it, but provides a persuasive rationale for why we should let go of our common sense abhorrence of contradiction and instead embrace the existence of contradiction. Hegel's foundation-free metaphysics contains a two-part division. Part one establishes the negative, critical project of analyzing the many problems, distortions, and misconceptions of reality that arise from the artificial separation of the universal from the particular. In contrast, the second part of Mauss's book adopts a positive, constructive approach by recognizing Hegel as a proponent of what Mauss calls rational dialetheism. Building on Graham Priest's theory of dialetheism, Mauss defines rational dialetheism as the position that contradictions not only exist, but also produce dialectical developments of rationality. Mauss's engagement with Priest is part of a larger contribution Mauss makes in his book to underscore the relevance of Hegel's philosophy for contemporary debates about the nature and logic of contradiction. Moss proposes that, for Hegel, if we deny the existence of contradiction, one of two things occur. Either we are forced also to deny the existence of the absolute, or we are led into the depths of a series of paradoxes that distort fundamental reality. Quoting Moss here, as long as the principle of non-contradiction is presumed to have a privileged absolute status, the absolute can neither exist nor be known. Philosophers who are committed to recognizing the existence of the absolute as the indubitable, universal, and necessary origin of thought and reality, but who nevertheless assume that the law of non-contradiction is undisputed, are left to concede that the first principle of the absolute is really two principles from the outset. Since the universal is always instantiated as the particular, one must either acknowledge that the universal and the particular begin simultaneously as a contradictory singularity, or begin from a conception of the universal that comes already divided into the dual and separate principles of universality on the one side and particularity on the other. This dualism appears in many forms: as the fundamental division between identity and difference, as the determinations of determinate being, as the categorical separation between the finite and the infinite, as the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, etc. Serious problems arise, however, for the philosopher who attempts to reconcile the existence of the absolute with the principle of non-contradiction by positing dualism at the starting point through any of these formulations. The question of how the dualism is a dualism in the first place, of what causes the particular to divert from the universal, or of difference to be somehow distinct from identity, reveals a series of disruptive paradoxes that significantly misinform us about the organization and fundamental nature of reality. According to Moss, distortions of fundamental reality come in 6 forms: the problem of nihilism, chapters 1 and 2, the problem of instantiation, chapter 3, the problems of the missing difference and absolute empiricism, chapter 5, the problem of ontotheology, chapter 6, and finally the problem of the third man regress, chapter 7. Moss's detailed examination of these 6 paradoxes serves 2 functions. One, each paradox exposes how our common sense bias toward PNC contributes to distortions of reality, much like Kant's dialectic in the Critique of Pure Reason explores distortions of reality that occur when we attempt to extend reason beyond the conditions that make reason possible. 2, the task of critically analyzing the failures of these 6 paradoxes helps us to recognize why Hegel is led to the conclusion that contradiction exists. In other words, Moss establishes the exposition of the failure of each paradox as a premise that helps to support Hegel's rational dialetheism. Although the introduction is quite clear and helpful, Moss's book is on the whole too long and complicated to function as an introduction to the problem and proposed solutions of the absolute. So this is, I guess, a criticism of density. The book is long and dense, and that's not bad. But it'll reach a certain audience, I guess, is the point I'm making here. The book may appear dense even for an advanced reader who knows Hegel and the German idealist tradition well. Some readers might feel that there are accessibility issues. For example, even though the introduction clearly outlines how chapters 1 to 7 will address the various distortions that emerge from assuming PNC, Moss could have underscored his analysis of these distortions more clearly in the body of these chapters. So sometimes this reader found himself disoriented in spots, and it's a small criticism. One is left instead to wonder what the summation of these distortions really amounts to once the analysis is worked through. But this is on the whole a small issue for the accessibility and readability of the ideas in Moss's book, which is partly alleviated by the excellent introduction and which could be addressed further in a shorter future prolegomena work from Moss. So one reason I bring that up is to draw out this question that maybe you could address, Greg, about how this book fits into your projection of future work. And so one idea is there a smaller piece that might come out that would introduce this piece? That's kind of one thought I have. And then I have one more point, which is maybe a larger question. While much of Moss's book is devoted to the negative project of analyzing the failures and paradoxes that emerge when we attempt to reconcile the existence of the absolute with the law of non-contradiction, in contrast to this, the positive contributions of Moss's book come in the form of an exploration of Hegel's rational dialetheism as one of two possible solutions to the problem of the absolute. Hegel is a proponent, the main proponent of rational dialetheism, the view that the existence of contradictions leads to the expansions of rationality. Although Hegel's foundation-free metaphysics is not a commentary of the logic as a book as a whole, it's not a full commentary of the whole book like some secondary literature is. Moss's book examines as the positive contribution of the project what is arguably one of the most important themes of the logic, the concept of singularity. Moss's discussion of singularity gives scholars a fresh and very plausible textual interpretation of some of the most difficult passages of the doctrine of the concept and the question of how difference arises out of identity. Or we could say similarly, the question that Greg, referring to you by your last name, which is sort of formal, that you mentioned in your response a moment ago, how does the infinite become finite, right? So I think there's maybe sort of different registers of that question. How does difference arise out of identity is kind of a different register. Moss also situates Hegel's exposition of singularity and specifically the central problem of the book, that is how to conceive of the existence of the absolute, within the trajectory of Western philosophy by outlining fruitful comparisons of Hegel with Aristotle and Kant, as well as placing Hegel into dialogue with other philosophers in the German idealist tradition, especially Jacobi, Fichte, and Schelling. Moss claims that there are actually two adequate solutions to the problem of the absolute. Both break from the assumption that PNC is a fundamental axiom of reality. The first solution, which his book details extensively, deals with the rational dialetheism approach. Rational dialetheists attempt to make the absolute comprehensible. Hegel achieves this through the concept of singularity, which unites the universal and the particular prior to their division by way of non-contradiction, by reconceiving the concept as self-particularization and self-differentiation. Moss also mentions a second solution, mystical dialetheism. Unlike Hegel, who attempts to comprehend the absolute and thereby to recognize the existence of contradiction, the mystic admits that the absolute starting point of first philosophy is incomprehensible. While Moss mentions this second project in passing, Hegel's foundation-free metaphysics directly focuses only on the first project of rational dialetheism with Hegel. Readers are left to wonder whether another book project is in the works, a project that is as critical of Hegel's commitment to rationalizing and comprehending the absolute as it is critical of the distortions that emerge from the common assertion that PNC is indisputable. So that's the book review I've written. And the question I have for you, Greg, is just in this last paragraph here, do you have another book in the works on mystical dialetheism. What's the relationship between the rational dialetheist and the mystical? Why would you only attribute the rational to Hegel? Like, what is really the difference between the two? Do you ultimately feel that one of the approaches is more effective? Are they both effective? Can the division be reconciled? So these are broad questions I have for you about your future.
Yeah, there was great timing, actually. We have now a lot of time for Greg to address your points, and then maybe we can continue to discuss. I mean, maybe we can also ask questions, I think, right?
Yeah.
So, but let me first give the word to Greg.
Okay, thanks, Nahum, for the thoughtful review. And the last question you asked is really hard for me. And it's because it's where all my thinking is. And it's very much undergoing development. But I hope I can share some thoughts about the struggles I have in answering that question. It won't be sufficient, but hopefully in the future book project, I'll be able to say something more precise. Let me just respond to some of the points that you raised earlier on, and then maybe I'll make some qualifications, and then I'll come to the last question, which I think is the most important, one of the most important aspects of the book. I'm glad that you focused on dialetheism rather than on the singularity, because we just spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but at least a little time, speaking about singularity with Alex, and now we can kind of look at the other aspect of the book, which is this dialethic aspect. So nice having both of you here so we can kind of cover the range of topics that the book tries to cover. So at the very beginning of the book, in the introduction, now I'm trying to come up with nice, first sentences. I know these are important in philosophy, but the first sentence is that independently of absolute existence, nothing else can be. And when I talk about the problem that today the existence of the absolute, that there's suspicion cast upon it, I'm not just speaking about, say, Critique of Metaphysics from the analytic and continental sides of philosophy, although I am speaking to those traditions as well. There's also this, the living theorist Marcus Gabriel, who says the world doesn't exist. The absolute, my term for this is absolute rather than a world. And so I have a chapter in which I try to respond to his view that the absolute doesn't exist. So on the one hand, the book is a defense of the world against Marcus Gabriel's view. The absolute exists, and the claim that it exists, I think, is a true contradiction. And so I'm generally sympathetic to a lot of the arguments he makes because they draw on the paradoxes that I'm working on. I just think that the conclusion is not correct. So I'm very interested in the way in which those paradoxes are working in his work. And so the dialetheism is just the view that there are true contradictions, or that some contradictions are true. Of course, not that all contradictions are true necessarily, at least some. And one of those, I think, is the claim that the absolute, the existence of the absolute, or that the world exists, that the absolute exists, is one of those true contradictions. So that's, using the term dialetheism, I could have left that term out. In a way, there's no reason to use the term, except to kind of connect it with, I think, some of the contemporary developments and discussions. And it's also a way to draw in some of the analytic discourse into the discussion. So I am very much interested in some of these contemporary developments in dialetheism and how you can use them in a way to try to defend the world and the existence of the world. That's just a comment. And you mentioned Grand Priest, but I really want to emphasize that I don't take a formal view of logic. So you know, and that Hegel does not have a formal view of logic. So saying, because whenever someone hears that name Grand Prix, some people think, okay, it's we have paraconsistent logic. We have a paraconsistent theory of inference or entailment, and then we have a dialectic theory of truth. But Hegel doesn't have this formal theory of logic, and that's true. And I don't think that he does. In fact, I tend to think about both Grand Priest and Hegel as proponents of some kind of rational dialectism. But different in kind. You could say species of rational dialectism. But it is encouraging to hear, you know, very visible philosophers like Grand Prix say that Hegel was right. You know, I find that to be encouraging. And so just I wanted to note that qualification. Yeah, you're not the first person to ask me to write a prolegomena to the work. I think I'll just go ahead and say it. I think David Merrill, also one of Richard's old friends, has suggested that I write, and I just don't know if I'm able constitutionally to write short books. Maybe one day I'll be able to, but I just don't have the skills to be that concise. I mean, this is part of the problem. Yeah, the critique is well taken. Actually, the book is it's a bit too dense. And I'm very thankful for the editors at Routledge that really forced me to reduce it by 200 pages. I mean, it was going to be unwieldy. So the editors at Routledge deserve some credit for not allowing me to just publish what I wanted, actually. Let me get to the bread and butter then. Finally, to the last question about the mystical dialethism. Since some people might think it's very strange for, you know, a Hegel scholar to talk about mysticism, indeed any philosopher to talk about mysticism. Some might think of some kind of idiosyncratic religious interest or something, which it might be, but I actually think that the arguments that I lay out in the text actually show that mysticism, at least in some form, offers really a challenge to the rational dialectist point of view. So I just want to briefly say something about that. I do give in the book one of Hegel's critiques of this view. Hegel doesn't call it mystical dialectism, but in the book I try to give Hegel's critique, and I'll repeat that here. So to kind of draw out the difference between these two, I want to talk about the problem of the missing difference and apply it to the question about the absolute. So when we traditionally think about the universal as divided into two principles, principle of universality, principle of particularity, we conceive that the universal is only a principle of unity and not a principle of difference. So the concept of the animal tells you what all animals have in common, but doesn't differentiate the kinds of animals. And then if you want to get the difference, you have to go outside of the category of animal and introduce that principle of difference into the category. Now, I think one of the motivations for having these two principles of universality and particularity is the fact that if you had, say, the universal differentiating itself, in the case of, say, an empirical concept like animal, what you might have is something like the human being is an animal just like the dog is. And what differentiates the human from the dog, if we said that it's also being an animal, then the very same thing in virtue of which the human would be the same as the dog would be that in virtue of which it is different. And clearly that isn't the case in the case of the animals, and you get a contradiction. And so to avoid that contradiction, we posit these two principles, principle of universality and principle of particularity. Now, this looks just fine when it comes to empirical concepts, actually. And in principle, it seems like the empirical concepts are governed by this differentiation. But when we apply that differentiation between universal and particular to the absolute, to the all-encompassing, the Henkaipan, the one and all, we find immediately a contradiction. And this is played out at the very beginning of Hegel's Science of Logic. You can play it out in many different ways. I'll just give one example now. If you think about, say, the concept of being, and you think about being as governed by this duality of principles, motivated by the principle of non-contradiction, then what you have is being only accounts for the identity of all beings, not their differences. And so then the question arises, where does the difference come from? The difference can't come from being, because being is a principle of unity. It says that each thing is. X is, Y is, Z is. It doesn't say what differentiates X, Y, and Z. And so the difference has to come from outside of being. But what's outside of being? Only nothing. And so the way to differentiate things is to appeal to nothing. But if nothing isn't anything, then you can't have a principle of difference. So you don't have the principle of difference in being. You don't have it in nothing. There is no difference at all. And so all things collapse into one, and all there is being. And that's basically what Parmenides says, right? To be, what is being. Now, this, of course, leads to contradiction, because when you say that being is undifferentiated or without difference, then you can't differentiate being from nothing, right? So being can't be different from nothing because there are no differences. So you find yourself in contradiction right away. And the contradiction happens because you want to elevate this difference of universal and particular that does seem operative at a relative level, at least at some point, to having an absolute or a singular status, at least in one sense of the singular. So you get a contradiction. Now, I think once we've stopped trying to avoid the contradiction, so a lot of my book is basically showing that there is no way to avoid that. A lot of my book is basically showing that all the solutions that try to avoid that contradiction or to escape it fail fundamentally. So Aristotle's account of the proscen genus, for example, is one way to try to avoid this. So Aristotle's pretty clear, being is not a genus. Being is said in many ways. And if you don't make this clear, or it's a kind of genus, it's a kind of proscen genus. But if you don't make this kind of qualification, Aristotle thinks you're going to end up in this contradiction. I try to give the argument in the book why I think that doesn't work. I'll just put that aside for now. But if people are interested, they can look at my critiques of the proscen solution to the problem. But once you come to this, once we've just given up on trying to avoid the contradiction, then the question that comes up for me is, what follows from this? Once we're saddled with a contradiction and we can't do otherwise. We can rethink the concept such that there can be true contradictions within the logic itself, which is what I think Hegel does. So we rethink the concept such that the contradiction can articulate truth. And that's what I call the rational dialethism. We can reject the principle of explosion, that contradictions are explosive, etc. And we can have this idea of productive contradiction that you and I have spoken about at some length. But I think there's another solution, which I think Hegel acknowledges and he critiques. And this is what I call the mystical solution, which is to say that, well, if a concept can only be true if it's not contradictory, and all of our thinking of the absolute ends up in contradiction, then the absolute transcends conceptuality, or one can't truly articulate the absolute in the concept. And this is the mystical position, which is to say the absolute exceeds the concept. The singular exceeds the concept, right? I think Alex put this on the board. This is on his PowerPoint. This was one traditional view. But I think it's a traditional, there are at least some formulations of the view which are motivated by the paradox that I think is inevitable. So the question is, do we reform the concept such that it can articulate true contradictions? Or do we say that in a way there cannot be a true contradiction on the side of logic, and so the absolute has to transcend conceptual determination? That's what I call mystical dialethism, and I think that it acknowledges the contradiction first, and not everybody does, okay? It has the advantage that it acknowledges at least this form of what I've called mystical. I call it mystical because it's the view that the absolute transcends the concept, and so the absolute can only be accessible in a trans-conceptual way. That's why I have that maybe very precise sense of what I mean by that. That may not map onto every form of mysticism, and there's a great variety and species of different kinds. We have Eckhart and Burma and Saint Teresa, and we have a whole host of different methodological spontaneous forms. I mean, it's a bottomless pit, right? So there's a lot to talk about, but I just want to stay with this basic idea. And one of the ideas I think Hegel refutes in the Science of Logic. So, he says that if you think of the absolute as transcending the concept, and then maybe you'll say the way to know the absolute is through intuition or some immediacy or something like this, maybe a kind of a pistol shot of intuition. The problem is that you end up limiting the absolute. You make the absolute one-sided because it excludes the conceptual. And insofar as the conceptual exists and the absolute can't be expressed by it, the absolute is limited and finite and relative. And so if you think of mystical dialetheism as the view that the absolute transcends the concept, you make the absolute relative and finite, you shrink it. So it's actually not as sublime as you think. So you think it's so sublime it can't be captured by concepts, but then what you do is you end up making it profane without even knowing that you're worshiping an idol, right? So there's a legitimate critique that Hegel has of this kind of view. Basically, it's not a true absolute. But one thing that we can't do, so I just wanted to kind of say that I do give that argument in the book, but that doesn't address all forms of mysticism, I think, because and I think there's some qualifications that I want to make about the argument there that I haven't had the time to discuss in the book itself. One of the things that we can't do, I just wanted to mention a couple things and then I'll stop talking about it, is that we can't charge the mystic for contradicting themselves and therefore not having a coherent view, and then from that position say that their claims are false, or that the view isn't legitimate. And I think here's why. The view of mystical dialetheism is that every conceptualization of the absolute fails. And so that means even their own claims about the absolute must fail. So if you say, well, look, you say that the absolute transcends reason, but you're reasoning. And they would say, exactly. All of the other accounts fail and mine fails too. And none of them succeed. And I bring myself to contradiction as well as everybody else and leave us there. Namely, if the mystic had a consistent view, then they would contradict themselves, actually, right? Because if their views were consistent, then they would be a counterexample to their own position. But rather, it's the consistency of their view is that they refute themselves as well as everybody else. And that is itself the demonstration. That's the lesson that no conceptualization of the absolute succeeds. So one can't simply, and this is what one of these rationalist blunders, is to underestimate the irrationality, right? So you say, look, your view contradicts itself. Exactly. That's the whole point of the view. So it's not enough to say that. I mean, Cassirer does this with the Lebensphilosophen, but it's not enough. You're just preaching to the choir. You're really just assuming what you want to prove the whole time, right? You're assuming that the absolute needs to be expressed rationally, but that's itself what is at stake. So it's not enough, right? So it's actually a very delicate matter, refuting these people. Whether it's even possible or worth our time is another question. But I just want to say, so it's a very nuanced, difficult set of issues. And I think one of the resources that's available to someone who holds the view that the absolute transcends the concept is to, in a way, invert the Hegelian position and say something like this. Rather than say the absolute is conceptual and the non-conceptuality is a kind of self-alienation of conceptual absoluteness, you say something of the opposite, namely, the absolute is transconceptual, and the conceptual is the self-alienation of the non-conceptual. Now, why is that not available to the mystic? Or my hypothetical thinker who says that the absolute transcends concepts? Because this view would be one in which the concept actually exists, but it is, say, truly represents the absolute in its self-alienation, in its Entfremdung or Entäußerung. Now, this may or may not be a view Hegel actually engages with, but it's a question for us to ask. Because there you would have the unity of the conceptual and the non-conceptual, but unified on the side of the non-conceptual, rather than have the, say, not the non-conceptual view being an alienation of the conceptual absolute. So, I mean, this is one of the classical critiques that always fails when someone's trying to critique Hegel. Someone takes up an anti-Hegelian position. But as we know, Hegel's logic, it incorporates the anti-Hegelian view, right? So you try to critique Hegel by positing the anti-Hegelian view, and that doesn't work. So I think that's what happened with Foucault and Levinas. Derrida himself pointed this out. But this is also a strategy that would be available arguably to someone who says that the absolute transcends the concept. This doesn't necessarily mean that the absolute doesn't exist in the concept. It may mean that the absolute exists in the concept. And because it does, it undermines the conceptual coherence of conceptuality. That is to say, that is why it is contradictory, why the concept has this contradictory property. So this is something that I'm thinking about now, something that I'm working on, which is once we've acknowledged and we've settled on the fact that the absolute exists and it exists and its existence can only be articulated as a true contradiction, what do we do in response to that? And then how do we understand this relationship between so-called rational dialethism and mystical dialethism? So I would like to write a book. I'm trying to write a book on this other option. I have a tentative title, something like The Fiction of Being. I don't know what it will look like or if it'll actually get written. And I'd like to put Hegel into conversation with this. One last thing that I'll say, I've spoken for too long, but obviously it's a huge interest and I haven't finished thinking about it, is that in a certain sense, the so-called mystical dialethism doesn't have any contradictions because they think the absolute transcends the concept. So if they really attempt to intuit the absolute in a trans-conceptual or non-conceptual way, whatever that would mean, if the concept disappears for them, then so does the contradiction, because you only have contradiction, it seems, if you have concepts. So there's a way in which one of these two views may in fact be able to overcome the contradiction by simply ceasing to think conceptually. That's not exactly a philosophical answer. It's really a problem resolution rather than problem solution. But anyway, this is just, I'm just throwing out a lot of ideas, but as you can see, it's kind of, it's in Bewegung right now in my mind. So thanks for the question. It's a hard question and we don't have to keep talking about it, but this is also the ground for my interest in mysticism historically and all the different kinds of mysticism, because I think it's underrated, and people should take it more seriously. It's not academically respectable, but that doesn't mean that it actually doesn't have a better view of the absolute than the others who don't even acknowledge the contradiction in the first place. That's my, maybe say, non-popular view about it. Sorry, that was a long, but.
That's good. Thank you. Nahum, do you have a brief follow-up remark or?
Well, I'll just thank you, Greg, for that really detailed response. And I mean, it helps me to kind of visualize your work, to hear what you're doing from there. I mean, it helps me to understand the book that you've written, also to see it as an approach of two.
Yeah.
And I mean, it really helps also to hear you re-articulate Hegel's criticism of the mystical, as you put it. Yeah. And I think what you were working through in some ways, as you spoke there, is, how this is quite a difficult project. What, the other sort of direction of questioning might be, how does the mystical dialetheism criticize Hegel? And another question, and this, I feel like I heard almost you betray yourself a little bit. Is there really a difference here? Is Hegel, is the mystical somehow included in Hegel's rational dialetheism? Is this a distinction that's going to fall away in a sense? I mean, these are questions you may come up with solutions to as you write further. But I just want to thank you for that response, and I hope that it materializes into further work.
Yeah, so do I. I hope I hope it. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I maybe I'll just give a quick response. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question. And I tend to think that they're really not. Right now, my thinking is that they're not compatible. So, I mean, at least from Hegel's own words, that he speaks about all the slander that's heaped on the concept. The slander that's heaped on it is, again, from these people who think the truth is incomprehensible, but it's because they don't have the right concept of the concept, right? And once you have the right concept of the concept, that slander is no longer justified. So I suppose that even if you want to make the argument, I think that somebody could, by close reading of Hegel's text, right, that maybe there's passages from unhappy consciousness to reason, or even revealed religion to philosophy. Or if you look at the introduction to the the preface to phenomenology, there are places where one could locate this, you could say, mystical view and see how Hegel incorporates it and then transcends it. So I definitely think that it certainly is there, right? But I think that it's canceled and preserved, arguably, right? Because if you take the view seriously that the absolute transcends the concept, you've actually relativized the absolute, as Hegel says, and you've made it determinate. You've made it into a determinate concept, and therefore you've actually undermined yourself in a way that's problematic, because you're actually advocating for the comprehensibility of the absolute without even knowing it. So I actually think this is a way for Hegel to incorporate it and then to make it disappear. So yeah, it's something that I want to engage with more thoroughly, and I just think that it deserves more attention, more work than it's been given. That's all. This is also why I'm very interested in, of course, Cecilia's work on Burma and Hegel, and also in Glenn McGee's work on the Hermetic tradition in Hegel. One of the, just one thing that I'll mention, with McGee talks about Hermetic mysticism as the view that God becomes complete through the human knowledge of God. So I take something like that is going on in Hegel, that actually, if the absolute doesn't exist in human knowledge, then the absolute is conditioned. It's excluded by human knowing, or it's somehow limited, finite, and relative to the human knowing in which it doesn't exist. So if the absolute is going to be absolute, it has, in a way, if it's going to be absolutely absolute, it demands that there be knowers who know it. And so in this way, if you think of the absolute as God, if you're comfortable with this kind of terminology, the absolute, in a way, becomes absolutely absolute in virtue of our knowing of it. And this is one way of thinking about philosophy as world spirit, Weltgeist. It's a kind of absolute self-knowing. Yeah, Cecilia's posted a nice comment in the, yeah, here it is. Right. Cecilia, maybe if you could chime in there and maybe say a few words about the comment that you, if that's okay, Emre? Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be very brief. I'm very interested in, of course, in what you're saying. And I was thinking of this distinction that Hegel makes, and I've seen that Alessandro just followed up about sort of an old meaning of mysticism and the new meaning of mysticism. And so mysticism that is philosophical, that, so as you were saying, so mysticism that takes the contradiction seriously, and it has a problem, what I think I've called the other day, a problem of translation, so of stopping, because it doesn't from a certain point onwards, it doesn't work conceptually, as you say, but the tension, the direction is towards conceptualization. And then there is the new meaning of mysticism, which just abdicates to that intent, so to the whole idea of contradiction in the end. So I really like your perspective of understanding Hegel's relation also historically to mysticism in terms of grasping contradiction in relation to the absolute. And also, he helps me to reconsider what I was saying the other day, that Hegel does not seem to be interested in Böhmer's concept of the Ungrund, or conception, which is a conception of the Ungrund, because perhaps what you were saying made me think maybe that because that is where there is a problem with mysticism. So that's where the translation is needed. So that's where Böhmer works with what he calls Vorstellungen rather than in the appropriate form of the concept. So what he's interested in is the other side. So the aspect of contradiction precisely. So it's a contradiction which is really inhabited. It's not resolved. I'll stop here, but I just wanted to say that your unpopular view of mysticism is at least popular with me. Thank you.
Well, that's good. I have somebody who is not totally put off. Yeah, thanks for your comments. Actually, very helpful. Yeah, this passage that you post is something that I've looked at. Yeah, he speaks about it in a few places, and it's something that I would like to more systematically engage in. I mean, I wanted to do some serious scholarship on it, but you already did it. So in a certain way, I don't. I just consult your book and some of the others who.
Essentially, there is also something to explore. Might be. So I have the impression, but that I think there is more there to explore. That he tries to make a difference between mystic and mysticismus. So they're not precisely the same. So he's trying to differentiate not just between different thinkers, but between fundamentally different ways of understanding what you were just saying. So either working with the contradiction towards grasping the absolute, or avoiding, or saying the absolute just cannot be grasped. And I think, if I don't misremember, so mystic is what he usually associates with the Romantics. So where there is the danger of that jump. Exactly. While mysticismus is what he associates more with, for instance, the Neoplatonists, precisely. Platonists, Böhmer. So they are really in the same boat, interestingly. So Böhmer and the Neoplatonists, because of that tension.
Right, and I think so. This is something that I'm interested in, is this question of to what extent is Hegel rationalizing in a certain way a certain kind of mysticism or mysticismus, and then to what extent is he rejecting another sense of mysticism, the mystic. So I think that's a very interesting question for me to be thinking about. So thanks, that's very helpful.
And I think really lasting, but there is still really a lot of work needed to counter this idea that mysticism for Hegel is simply something esoteric.
Yeah.
So I think you would really welcome work from you in that respect. So there is also, of course, an esoteric mystical tendency, and that's the mysticism he criticizes usually, precisely because what you were saying. So I think this connection that you are making between mysticism and coming from the logic, I think that's very important, and that would I think really you have something there to explore. And it's also not by chance that a thinker like Böhmer comes up indirectly in the logic when Hegel talks about Qualität. So it's which is a concept grounded in the idea of contradiction, seen from a Böhmian perspective. So I think connecting mysticism so coming from your perspective, from the logic, is really a good answer to, so mostly, as you know, so that the scholarship on Hegel and mysticism has really focused on the early Hegel, so on the idea of the mystical tendencies at the shift and so on. Yeah.
Hegel that he gives himself to the all, and fancy brings the eternal into the
So basically, the usual narrative goes: first there is mysticism, then there is the logic.
Right.
And what you're saying, is obviously a counter argument for that. So
Yeah.
it's a more complex narrative. So mysticism is not it's some kind, at least, so mysticism are not an argument outside a lot.
Yeah, there's not two Hegels, there's one philosopher who develops, right? And the mysticism of his early youth, in a way, was a clue, at least certain forms of it, arguably. And I don't know, so I don't know, there's a lot to be said.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much.
Was...
I think it's very fruitful.
I just wanted
Thank you, Cecilia.
I just wanted to bring in some considerations that I think have come out from the discussion of Greg's, his work itself, and the two commentators, and that is the way in which any kind of adherence to the principle of non-contradiction precludes the intelligibility of singularity or individuality and self-determination.
Exactly.
And if you think about mysticism, where in a sense it involves an acceptance of the principle of non-contradiction, insofar as it is finding ineluctable contradictions, but recognizing that they transcend any kind of rational intelligibility or rational specification or conceptualization. The same thing is done by the ancient skeptics, who accept the principle of non-contradiction, and in uncovering contradictions have to suspend judgment. And all of this is sort of based on this great fear, which I think is expressed so strongly in Book Gamma of the Metaphysics, where Aristotle will show over and over again how if you don't accept the principle of non-contradiction, you end up confronting indeterminacy. But in a sense, we need to confront indeterminacy. That's what we need really to start with as philosophers, Hegel might argue. And which turns out is going to provide us with a basis for being able to account for determinacy, which you clearly can't account for if you are going to make use of determinate factors as what will provide the account. Obviously, you're operating in circles. You need to somehow constitute determinacy out of what is indeterminate, out of none other than, let's say, being and nothing. And you sort of see the reductio ad absurdum of upholding the principle of non-contradiction in Aristotle's culmination of his metaphysics, self-thinking thought, which I think contrasts very starkly with what Greg was saying about how the concept involves this kind of self-transcendence character, meaning in effect that it has a self-determining character, which involves a kind of self-individuating character. Whereas if you look at the self-thinking thought of Aristotle, which is in conformity with the principle of non-contradiction, what is it? It's completely immobile, completely non-developmental, thinking of itself as eternal thinking of the same old thought endlessly. And of course, it has no potentiality. It's just this pure actuality, which is, on the other hand, something devoid of any self-determination. And in Aristotle, in the ancient Greeks, there's this inability to think of self-determination, think the individual. And I think, you're pointing to a way of overcoming all of this, not being afraid of indeterminacy, and recognizing that by embracing indeterminacy instead of determinate foundations, you have a chance to conceive the concept and understand how it involves individuality and something self-determined. And I think these are all interesting points that I think all of the discussants have brought to bear, how these things go together.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe I just add, I know that we're over and we have to stop. I could just keep talking about this forever, but one thing that
30 seconds.
It's okay, 30, okay, is that, thanks, Henry, is the concept of self-determination. So I don't think that we can have a concept of freedom that's successful if we're beholden to the principle of non-contradiction. I don't think that there's any like philosophically defensible view of freedom if you hold on. I think that actually the concept is self-contradictory. So it's an important dimension here, that the concept is self-determining, the concept is free. So I think this notion of freedom is really important here, obviously, not only in the logic, but also in right and in the practical domains as well. One of the things that I'll just finish with is that even if we begin with indeterminacy, right, the beginning is anarchical. It doesn't necessarily end there. I think that's in a way what seems to happen with certain forms of mysticism is that the anarchism is never overcome. But with Hegel, in a way, you get something like the Aristotelian result, let there be one Lord. But the one Lord has to prove himself. That is, say, the agency of the concept has to develop out of this kind of anarchical Anfang and establish itself as Hegel says, the only element of truth. He says that the concept is the only element of truth. So what's really interesting to me is how, first, we don't shy away from the indeterminate, we face it and see in a way in Hegel how it develops into the agency of the concept, which is self-particularizing, self-determining, and self-realizing. So that's another way of putting the question that has interesting practical consequences and questions about whether the anarchism of the beginning can be overcome, right, or not. And I think that's a very interesting question that we could apply to practical considerations, but I'll just leave it at that for now. So
I also have many questions, but I will save them for our interview, which will also be uploaded to our website and to the YouTube channel quite soon, I think, right?
Yeah.
So this was the final session of our first online conference. I'd like to thank once again all the speakers and everyone who watched our sessions on YouTube. Let me finally check if anyone has questions. David, Dr. Merrill was watching us, but looks like he doesn't have a question. I look forward to meeting all of you in future events, but before we close the panel, Richard, why don't you make a perhaps closing speech as a president of the Society for Systematic Philosophy?
Yeah, I want to thank both Greg and Emre for, in a sense, rejuvenating the Society for Systematic Philosophy and setting it up on a new world-encompassing framework, fully embracing the virtual reality that the pandemic has thrown us into, creating the website we have, and instituting the first of what I hope will be many events of this sort and this caliber, where we bring people together from all over the world in discussing this enterprise of under the inspiration of Hegel, seeing to what degree we can think without foundations and escape all of the difficulties that have been plaguing the philosophical tradition. You know, we are doing something that, as I think we all know, is out of the mainstream in terms of the philosophical academy, but has a certain foothold here and there. And I'm hoping that with our presence on the web, on YouTube, and the dispersion of wandering academics all over the place, that the discussion will grow and intensify. And I look forward to more events of this kind. I want to thank all of you for participating, and I look forward to the future before us. Thank you.
thanks. Yes. I need to learn how to use these little reactions. Sorry, here. Okay, there we go. Okay, I did it. Okay. Yeah, and let me also just say thanks, Alex, and thanks, Nahum, for your comments. I really appreciate you reading the book and giving me questions, critiques. It really is an honor to have people of your caliber read my book. So I'm honored, and thank you very much for your comments and critiques.
The honor was all mine. Thank you very much. It was a great discussion. I look forward to the next one.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully we'll have one soon. Excellent.
And then perhaps we'll have a book discussion on your forthcoming book on a logic.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. It was a great seminar. Thank you again.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I guess we'll sign off.
Yeah,
I guess
you're the one. Yeah,
Zoom.
you're the one.
I'm the host of the Zoom meeting. Sorry. Okay. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Have a good morning. Have a good night, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you. This was a great honor.
Bye.
Yeah,
Thank
cheers.
you. Bye-bye.
This is Maya.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.